Okay. Kenneth J Williams, Williams.
Okay, now you were talking about going to school for
Yes,
civil engineering.
I started school at Humboldt State College in Arcata, California in September of 1942, hoping to go on and get a degree in civil engineering to continue an opportunity within the U.S. Coast Geodetic Survey. And then in December of 1942, I received my notice that I was going to be drafted in the first 18, 19-year-old draft. And we went to San Francisco just before Christmas and took our physicals and were sworn into the Army at that point. But we didn't have to report until after New Year's in 1943. And there I reported to Presidio Monterey in Monterey, California. And that started the trip through the military.
Well, tell us about your initial training phase and then take us to how you wound up in the field artillery.
Okay. The after going through the being processed into the Army, I was selected to go to Camp Hood, Texas, to be trained in the area of tank destroyers. And so being sent out to Camp Hood and going through tank destroyer training, and at that particular time, this area was a very hot area because we were fighting in Africa, and the tank destroyers were a big part of our offense in North Africa. So the turnaround was fairly quick. After 13 weeks of basic training, normally you went to Africa. For some particular reason, which I never did figure out, I was sent back to another outfit. In fact, my whole group, we were sent back to another outfit within the tank destroyers and went through basic again. And after we got that particular part done, we were assigned and we established the 6666 Tank Destroyer Battalion, and then we were combat ready. We were a unit. We were combat ready. At that particular point, we were successful in Africa, and we were beginning to look at the invasion of Italy at that time. And they decided that they didn't need any more tank destroyers. So our whole battalion was sent to Camp Bowie to become an armored artillery battalion. And there's where I got my initiation into the field artillery. And after we got our training and so on, we were selected, a group of us were selected to go out and replace field artillery people, which we never knew where that was or anything about it at that point, that we were going to go into the field artillery unit, combat unit. And after a long train ride from Texas, we landed in Columbia, South Carolina at Fort Jackson. And then is when we learned that we were a part of the 87th Infantry Division, and I was assigned to the 334 Field Artillery Battalion of the division. And then we went into concentrated training and so on, and then became available for combat. And we did not participate in any combat until later in the fall. We were shipped to England, where we reassembled, and then shortly after Thanksgiving, we then were shipped to France, and we loaded on LSTs and went to France.
Before we get to combat with 87th in Europe, can we talk just a little bit more about the tank destroyer training, because we haven't really interviewed many people that have that training. What kind of weapon systems were you trained on at that time?
When I first went into the tank destroyers, what they had was a half track with a 75 millimeter gun on it. And our training at that particular point was that you, and especially in the desert warfare, they pretty well could, by reconnaissance, could spot enemy tank columns and this type of thing. So they could figure out maybe where these tank columns would be coming, and the big job was to move your tank destroyers into a position, and you dig them in, literally dig them in the sand, and sort of get behind what they call the military point on a hill, so that they would have a direct fire if a tank column came by. And but the 75 millimeter gun had no effect upon a Royal Tiger tank. And then we all were trained on hand-to-hand fighting with tanks, which was the interesting situation, is that you dig a foxhole in the line in the road, and get into the foxhole, and as a tank comes over you, you stick a magnetic mine on its belly, and then it goes by, and then you throw a Molotov cocktail up on the air vents. Or you can set out a way, and they ran a what they called a Bangalore torpedo. You can just shove those right into the bogey wheel, and that would blow the track off of the tank. That was sort of exciting training and so on, and in the training part, we had to be in the holes and let the tanks go over us and do all those things in practice, so on.
That probably gets your attention, a tank
running. Right, it does. One of the first time we did this, I didn't quite have my head down far enough, and the track dropped in and dropped. I began to learn real quick there was a bottom to the foxhole, and so I kept my head down after that. But at that particular time, they started realizing that they were going to have to come up with a heavier armament, and they developed. They took the General Sherman tank chassis and put a different turret on it, put an open turret on it, and put a 3-inch gun on, and they called that an M10. And this gave them a greater firepower. And I spent most of my training in the headquarters company, and I was and my proficiency was when radio operator. And so I was sort of the exec officer's radio operator during most of all of our maneuvers and training, but we still had to do everything else. We didn't have to shoot the guns, but we had to be able to personally go out after a tank if we had to. But the the interesting thing was that the M10 3-inch gun could not penetrate the Royal Tiger tank. That tank was so well armored that it wasn't until quite later into the European that we did get a gun that would penetrate. But one of the things that the Royal Tiger had, and this is what they trained these gunners on, would be that the underbelly of the tank was quite light armored. And I can remember out there watching these gunners. They put a delayed fuse on the shell. They would shoot the shell so it would hit on the ground right in front of the tank, and then it would skip in underneath and on a secondary explosion get them from underneath. And it took quite a skill to be able to do that. And so I don't know how successful they were actually in combat in doing that, but that was a knack that they developed, and that was quite interesting to see that done. But but anyway, the tank destroyers did proceed through the invasion of Sicily and then into Italy, and they also were very active in the invasion at Normandy and on through the whole European. They were there supporting more or less a support group to the ground forces.
So then you go from being tank destroyers to being armored artillery. Talk to us about the armored artillery a little bit and what those vehicles were like.
Well, they were at that particular point they were developing a chassis to house a 105 Howitzer, and we were in our training. We were just in that transition period of trying to move a 105 Howitzer and pretty well use it as the same as you would a regular pole weapon, but you would be more in a direct combat type thing instead of setting up and then shooting. And we didn't get we probably had about I've sort of forgotten now, but 3 to 4 months training in this area before then we were pulled out and shipped out as replacement to the different divisions that were getting ready. And so there we went right into the standby artillery units, and the unit I was in, it was a 105 artillery.
Well, talk to us a little bit about coming to the 87th Infantry and how were you received? I mean, you know, you're trained people, but you're new guys to this unit that's already been formed. So how did they welcome you in and give you a hard time?
Well, yes, that's sort of a yes and no answer. We were welcome, but we were not the same guys. We weren't the guys that were activated the division. I had an interesting situation. My best buddy that I had going to school and so on, we maneuvered it so that we were drafted the same time. We went out on the same situation, and hopefully maybe we could stay together. And when we were in Monterey, he they couldn't fit him with his shoes, so they had to get some different shoes for him. And so then we split up at that point. And so he was, when he finally got situated, he was sent to Mississippi, and they activated the 87th Infantry Division. And he was in an artillery battalion. And so all this time when we were riding on the train going to the East Coast, not knowing where we're going, the night before they told us that you are going to be a part of the 87th Division. The train will be in, and you'll disembark about 5 o'clock in the morning, and then you'll be taken for breakfast and then assigned. And so we got there, and I got off onto the loading dock and was standing there, and I realized that what these sergeants were telling us, that there was a bunch of trucks lined up for us to get into the trucks, because they were going to go to the field artillery kitchens for breakfast. And I walked up to a first sergeant there, and I said, I have a buddy who is in the 335 artillery headquarters battery. I said, is one of these trucks going there for breakfast? And they said, oh yeah, this one over here is going. Why don't you go ahead and get in that and go over there for breakfast? And so I got over there, and the first sergeant came in, walked in, welcomed us, and so on. And I said something to him. I said, by the way, I said, I'm a personal friend of Bob Wakefield, and he's in your unit. And he says, yeah. He says I got to go back. I'll go back and tell him that hurry him up a little bit and come over. You can have breakfast together. So pretty soon he came. The first sergeant came back, and he says, I'm sorry, but he says he was one of the boys shipped out 2 days ago. So we missed each other by 2 days, and it was sort of an interesting coincidence and so on. But no, the thing is, it was difficult meshing in with the ones who were the part of the division when they were activated in Mississippi in first part of 1943. And so you did have the feeling that you were with them, but you're not with them type thing, because there were, in details and so on, you could see the situation. And but being that I was a trained operator, a radio operator from the tank destroyers, immediately became a part of the Forward Observers team, with the Forward Observer and the radio operator and so on. So our job was to go with the infantry and be with them until they got pinned down, and then we would give artillery support. So basically my combat experience was actual online combat, and most of my days that I was in the combat zone, I was under some kind of fire and this type of thing. And we were always, the lieutenant and I was always looking for a place to where we could get the best advantage to be able to bring artillery fire into a infantry area and so on.
What sort of training did you get when you first joined the division as an FO radio man? Did he give you any extra or special training?
Not too much. The thing basically, you had to have full knowledge and the full nomenclature, and basically was of the radio that we used and all this. I was well instructed on it and knew it very well, and basically it was sort of giving you the learning part was what you actually did. In other words, what were we doing out there? Well, we were out there to spot where there is incoming fire that needs to be taken out. In this particular thing, you had to know map reading, knowing how to figure out coordinates and be able to refer these back to your fire devarties that set up and orchestrated the guns to shoot at those coordinates and so on. So it was a matter of map reading and things. How do you conduct yourself in those particular situations? And the main thing was that you were a target, and they really pressed this on you that you can be spotted and you can be picked out as being FOs. You're not a part of the infantry, and that you are a threat to the enemy. And so we got a lot of training on how you conduct yourself, and I had many occasions that we were in that we had to use them, or else we would have never made it. And so that was primarily the training I had while getting initiated into the division and into that particular. And I was assigned a forward observer lieutenant that I worked with, and he and I pretty well worked this thing out, and we were together most all the time in combat, and so.
You get pretty close to the lieutenant. The line between officer and enlisted men get a little blurred.
Yeah, it does. You become a team, and the one thing I always this lieutenant was from Hershey, Pennsylvania, and at different times, especially when we were in combat, we'd be going from place to place. He would always, we sort of get get our daubers down or something or other, and he would say, well, he said, you know, when I get home, I'm going to find a woman who can make glazed donuts like my mother. And we were always talking about his mother's glazed donuts and this type of thing. And no, it was a great uplift. We had a job to do, and we were a team to do that. And so you had your part to play, and he had his part to play. And so basically, the relationship between officer and enlisted person, that wasn't any particular issue. And
did you guys have a Jeep or did you walk?
we had a Jeep, and how we usually worked was that the infantry, when they're moving in, their heavy weapons, like their BARs and mortars and so on, were stored in a trailer, sort of a 1-ton trailer, and they were pulled by a Jeep. And so as the infantry is marching down the road, getting to their combat area, the heavy weapons jeep followed behind. So we would pull in behind the heavy weapons jeep and follow them, and then when they would get the signal to come, and then they would take all their heavy weapons out of it. At that point, the FO and I would get out of our jeep and then fall in line with and walk the rest of the way into the combat zone. But other than that, most of the time we rode, and we had we had a lot of different experiences with that situation.
We'll get into it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I bet you know how to heat C-ration cans on a
yes. Right.
Pretty handy.
Right. Along that line was that I wasn't a smoker. I didn't smoke, and so what I used to do was that on our C-rations, the dry can, as we called them, which always had 4 cigarettes in it. And I used to take the cigarettes and trade for either the lemonade or the hot chocolate. To me, that was the most important thing, and especially in the Battle of the Bulge, that became very, very important to get a hot drink at different times. And so that's what I did with my C-rations on that. I was always trading my cigarettes for the drinks.
Well, tell us a little bit about the ride over to Europe. How'd you get from the States to Europe, and what was that like?
That was sort of interesting. We all we had moved to Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, which was actually the point of departure out of New York Harbor. And so we got the day that we were to leave, we all loaded on trains and went to the harbor, and we got out and got on the docks, and there were barges there that everybody got on, and they were taken across the river to the terminals that are on Manhattan. And so when we got down to our group, the order came back that there had been a miscommunication, and that another unit had got on to the troop ship, and there wasn't any room for us. So we were told to get back on the train, and we went back to Camp Kilmer. The rest of the division went across and went to England. So we went back, and in about 10 days, they did get us worked out to that we would ship over, and then we did the same thing, went back. This time we got a trip across the river to the terminal, and we loaded onto a troop ship, and the troop ship that we loaded onto was the Pasteur, which was one of the French liners that the British had taken and converted, and being that it was one of the large ships, they went not by convoy, because their speed was fast enough that they didn't have to be convoyed. So it took us 5 days from New York, and we landed in Liverpool, England, and but it was a 5-day trip across the ocean, which was quite interesting, and it was a lot faster and a lot from the conditions and so on better than if you were going across on one of the regular troop ships that they had for that.
Okay, hold on while we change tape.
Okay. And we were in England about 10 to 12 days. The division got back together, and one nice thing was that Thanksgiving was right at that time, so we had a nice Thanksgiving dinner, and then we moved out and convoyed to Plymouth down on the south east coast, and there we loaded into LSTs and started across the English Channel. And as we had an experience on that was that we got out there and a storm came up, and the waves and the things were quite heavy, and the ship was bouncing around, and I sort of a curious type person. I sort of went up and looked out to see what was going on, and the sailors on there, they were a little concerned. They couldn't see why they weren't turning around, because on those flat bottom LSTs, they were coming up and then dropping 10, 15 feet right straight down on the water, and everything was started, just the whole ship would violate or vibrate. And finally they decided to turn around. So they did turn around, and we went back to Plymouth and stayed all night. And then the next morning we got up and took off again. And the sea had calmed down, and we were able to come across with ease. And we came into Le Havre, and then went right on up the Seine River. And this was at the end of November, 1st of December. And we disembarked in Rouen, France, which was a town above Le Havre. And at that particular point, we then put ourselves together and moved out. And going back and looking at the situation, it was sort of in that period of the pause in France there, that when Patton, the so-called, ran out of gas and everything sort of stopped before they could move along, and so we sort of, I don't know how many new divisions came in at that time, but we were one of those, and so we were assigned to Patton's Third Army, and from there we moved directly to Metz, France, which was a resistance area, because that was the Maginot Line that France had built after World War I to keep the Germans from coming into France again. But if I remember my history right on that Belgium was very unhappy about that and would not let them build their line along their border. So the Maginot Line went along the borders there between Germany and France and so on. And then when the Germans did invade and come around, they came around through Belgium and back up. And so the Maginot Line had no effect in World War II, because they skirted it. But then when they were being forced back, then they used it for their protection. And so our first job was to move into that area, and our first combat firing was at this fort, or the line, the pillboxes and so on. And we we got some very strict instructions and so on, and immediate lessons in culture and the situation, and said, well, you're now in the Alsace-Lorraine area. You cannot trust anyone. You are not to be in any contact with any civilian, because in that particular area, you don't know who is German sympathizer and you don't know who is a French sympathizer, because the country had changed over the centuries, so on. And this was one of the problems. They had the Germans caught in the line, but still food and stuff was being taken into them by the civilians. And so our first thing was to, as far as the artillery was doing, we just sat there and fired on that, so that it would keep things sort of stabilized. And then our infantry went in and sort of into a hand-to-hand situation and routed them out of the line, and then we secured it at that point. And after we did that, with things being as they were at that time, that with the First Army having secured from there on up into the Netherlands and into Belgium, and Third Army was in the middle, and the Seventh Army was developing in southern France. We sort of were in the center, and so Patton's army turned southeast from that area. We went and went through the Saar Valley, and our goal was to move into Germany and take the town of Saarbrücken, which was in that situation. And as we were doing that, the Bulge developed, and the Germans came through. And at the time, I didn't have any idea what was going on or anything, but what actually happened at that particular point was that the Germans had made their breakthrough, and they were coming west through Belgium, and we just what we had there and what the British had above us wasn't enough to stop them. And which I've learned later that Patton told Eisenhower that he could stop them, and he convinced him that we would turn around and go north, and so he got permission to do that. We stopped right in the middle of the day what we were doing, and turned around and started driving west. We went to Reims, France. When we got to Reims, France, we stopped. They had a great big tent thing set up, and what that was, that we walked in one end of the tent, took all our clothes off, and went through and showered. The only thing we did, we put our names and our personal effects in our boots, and went through the shower and got the other end of the shower. Here was all new clothes put on. Here were our boots, and we put those back on, our personal stuff. Got back in our rigs and started driving. And we drove all that day, all the next day, all the next night, until we actually ran into the Germans west of Bastogne. And that's where we started our combat. And we started the 87th Division and the division there in the Third Army, and then the Third Army, one of their one of Patton's pet tank outfits, they went straight into Bastogne and helped the relief of the 101st that was surrounded there, and so we sort of secured the area, plus the other divisions that were with us, all the west side of Bastogne until then. Hodges, who was north of us, and then the British were above that, and that was all secured, and the Bulge had stopped.
Well, tell me about driving conditions. You said you drove from Reims into the Bulge. Tell me what that was like.
Well, it was.
I got a pretty good idea what it was
right.
Like.
Riding in a Jeep. I rode in the back seat. My seat was in the back seat of the Jeep. And as we drove north, it got colder, and it got colder and colder, and at this particular point, I remember that the lieutenant was thinking more of those glazed donuts. We were telling about his glazed donuts and so on, and but you sit there and grit your teeth and keep going, and then finally we ran into the snow and got our introduction into the cold weather fighting, and so we were when we made our contact, we were in the snow, and so when we started our counterattacks on the Germans and started routing them out of their holdings in that area, one instance to sort of give you an idea. I got a call that they needed a radio man, and they had selected I would be the person, and I would go with a scout. I would follow this scout and come up to a position where the infantry and the FO was in, and I remember walking through fields and fields of snow, and there was a moonlight night, and here you were just like silhouettes out there on the snow, and walking through that, it probably took us an hour or 2 hours to walk into where they were dug in, and I got there, and there was an infantry major met me, and he said, did you bring your bedroll? And I said, no, they didn't tell me to bring a bedroll. They said I was just going to come in. And he says, well, we're all bedded down. And he said, that isn't any problem. He says, I got a pretty big hole, and he says, I'm getting a little bit cold. And he says, the two of us will snuggle up and spend the rest of the night together, and which we did do. And then the next morning, everybody got up and started fighting and so on, and the FO and I got together and started doing our thing, and I don't think I could ever do it again, but at the time, your instincts and so on, I think, so rise to the occasion, and you get through them, and you really, it isn't any particular major problem other than you're cold and all this type of thing. But the thing is, at that particular time, you didn't know that average night temperature was below zero, too, and not knowing that is always a good thing too. You know, that gives you a little fortification. And so we moved out, and we drove the Germans back out of that area. And we had spent one day. It was a very fierce fighting day. We knew that there was being a lot of casualty, and there was a lot of fire. We were firing almost constantly, and we finally realized that the Germans had moved out, and we secured the area, and we're going to stay at this particular position that night. And then there was a courier came and talked to the lieutenant, and he came over. He came to me and he said they lost so many company commanders today. They want me to take over an infantry company for the night. And he said, I'll meet up with you tomorrow, and so on. So the FOs all were taken out and sort of became pro tem company commanders for that night. And in the middle of the night, the Germans counterattacked, and they came back in, and they had us surrounded. And so there was a group of about 6 of us that everywhere we looked there was a German tank where they were moving in, and we were trying to figure out how in the world are we going to get out of here. And one of the things, we definitely didn't want to get captured. And in trying to figure out what to do and so on, it looked like there was, if we would run down through an alley and out on the other side of some buildings, it looked like it might be, we could get out into an open field. And which we did do, and we got out there, and pretty soon a tank picked us up and they started shooting at us with their machine gun, and we got down, and it just happened to be that there was enough of a swale there that the bullets came close enough to scorch our necks, but they were not enough to hit us. And so then they pulled out, and we got up and started running, and we ran almost all night back up into another area, and then we found a building. We laid down and tried to get some sleep, and then when daylight came, we began to realize where we were, and we got back to the FOs, or the artillery headquarters. And when we got there, the lieutenant was there, and he says, go get yourself a radio and get it set up, because we're going right out. And I said, okay. So I went over and to the supply sergeant and so on, and they said, well, we got one all set up for you. It's all ready to go. It's on the Jeep and so on. All you have to do is get in and go. And so I told the lieutenant we were all ready, and so we got in and took off. And as we came up to the infantry group that was moving, there was a tank corps there. There were 4 tanks, General Sherman, and they were following behind the infantry, and the heavy weapons carrier was falling behind the tank. So we decided, well, we'll just stay behind, like we always do. We'll just stay behind that. So we were moving down this road, and pretty soon the lieutenant says, he says, I think what I'll do is get out, and I'll run down there and get with the company commander and get some ideas as to what he knows, and get some ideas as to what we might be running into. And he said, once you and the Jeep driver just wait until we get to that point. So I moved up into the front seat and was sitting there, and we were driving along, and I happened to notice that the first sergeant of the infantry company gave the driver of the heavy weapons the high sign to come around the tank. So I told my driver, then I said, let's just follow him around the tank. Went around the first tank, went around the second tank, and as we went in between the first and the second tank, the heavy weapons Jeep blew up. Just blew right completely up in front of us, and had hit a stack of teller mines. And we stopped, and by that time we realized that the tanks were in reverse, and the tank ahead of us was coming up on our Jeep. And so I tried to get out, and just at that time, trying to get out, the windshield dropped down across my legs, pinned me in the Jeep, and I couldn't get out. The driver got out. He ran around the front and hollered at the driver of the tank to stop, which he did do. But I was sitting there, and I had my hands on the track like this, and trying to throw that tank off, and he stopped about right there. And it was right the point that the weight didn't come back on the back and come down on me. And so then they drove off, and there was the tank commander. The way I was sitting, I was looking right at the top of the turret. The tank commander poked his head out, and he got up and he looked down and he saw me in this Jeep smashed. And so he was a great big black man, and he came out of there and jumped off of that tank, and he came over and he grabbed a hold of that windshield and he just ripped that off of me. And then he very tenderly got in underneath me and lifted me out of the Jeep. And he walked around and he says, "Are you all right? You all right?" I said, "I'm fine." I said, "I don't know." Here he was carrying me. And I said, "Well, put me down and let me see if I'm all right." I said, "Feels all right." And so he finally put me on my feet and so on, no problem at all. And later on, I began to realize that he just couldn't hardly walk. And come to find out, he may have fractured his ankle, and he jumped out of that tank onto the snow. But he came up worse off in the deal than any of them, I think. And so anyway, that stopped that day's operation, and for us anyway. And we didn't get any. We went into a building and spent the night there. And the next morning we went back to our headquarters. And when I got there, the battery commander said to me, he says, "Well, we have decided that we're going to send you over to see a doctor." And I said, "Well, I feel fine," and so on. He says, "No, I think you need to see a doctor." So they loaded me up and took me over to a particular building and went in, and in that particular area, the people were all farmers, and they had their cattle, and they usually had their cattle underneath, and they lived up above. And we walked into this building, and which was hay and stuff all there, and I remember it was a big fireplace in one end. They had a fire in that. And the doctor came to me and he said, "How do you feel?" I feel fine. I said, "I don't have any problem from my tank deal," and so on. And he says, "No," he says, you got some other problems that we want to check on. And he said the first thing we're going to do is you're going to have some sleep. And he says find yourself a nice soft spot in the hay here and get settled down. And he came over and he had a little shot of scotch, and he said, you take this. I took it, and he gave me a pill. And so I guess I slept about 2 days. And after I woke up and everything, and we were talking and so on, and he said, well, he said, we gave you a blue 88. You took the blue 88 pill. That's all I knew about it. But I slept for 2 days and so on, and he said, well, you're in good shape, and so he sent me back to duty. And here, it's been 4 or 5 years ago or so, I saw a program on OPB where they went through and described the whole sequence of what the Blue 88 was. The thing is, I was right at the verge of a combat breakdown, and in World War II, in World War I, they call them shell shock, in this program, they said they developed this pill which with sodium pentothal with other things in it, and if a person could sleep 36 to 48 hours and so on and come out of that, if they can during this sleep and this rest, you can adjust back to your regular senses, then you're all right. But in a lot of cases, that didn't happen. Then they were shipped back as being disturbed and this type of thing. And I've often wondered that night that we were laying there in that building after the incident, I bet you I just kept those guys awake. I probably were screaming, and it was hard to say what you were doing. There's a reason why when we got to the camp that I had to go and have that. But it was nothing that the sleep was all I needed, and so I was able to go ahead and continue. And so after we finished up that particular thing, we moved down into along the Our River, which is south and east of Bastogne, and into the upper reaches of Luxembourg, and secured a line along that, because on the other side of the Our River was the Siegfried Line. And we went down, we were there firing into the Siegfried Line, and there was a period of time that they were softening it up and sort of regrouping from after the Battle of the Bulge. And I know the lieutenant and I always sat there and think, so he said, you know, one of the best thing could happen is as we would get pulled off of this position, because we could see what that situation was. If we went across the river, hit the line, we would immediately been in about 260-degree fire from that, and it would have been almost impossible to penetrate and so on. And so one morning we got the word that we were going to be relieved, and the 76th Division came in and took our position. We pulled out, went north up through Bastogne, and and headed east into Germany at St. Witz. They don't call those names are different in the Belgium language, and on into Germany. And we realized at that point we were on the north flank of the Third Army. Patton came in one night and briefed the division commanders and so on, and told them what they wanted done.
Hold on a second. Let us change tapes so we don't interrupt you.
What they were going to do, that they were going to advertise up and down the Siegfried line by leaflets and loudspeakers and so on, that on February the 7th, 1945, the Third Army was coming across. They were going to take the entire Siegfried line. And for all civilians and all people, they were to be out of it, and for their own protection, because the Army was coming full force. So what his plan was that the 87th Division, with support of the 4th Division and one of the armored divisions, would move out at daybreak on February the 6th, 24 hours before the invasion. And so our job, there was a little town out there called Prüm, Germany, and supposedly Prüm was the NCS, or the center communication center for the entire Siegfried line. And so the planners felt that if they could go in and secure that and break up, before they started their movement into the line, this might make things a little bit easier down the line, in which we all understood because we sat there and saw that. And so we took off right at daybreak and moved in and started through it. And the important thing that I was told, that Patton told them, especially to the infantry, he wanted them to understand that in the Stars and Stripes paper and so on, they had covered, pretty heavily with where the First Army went through the Siegfried line, and about 1 out of 25 pillboxes were occupied. But Patton says those guys who were in those pillboxes are in the pillboxes here. So he says, I don't want anybody to take anything for granted. And he said that you're going to find, because this is a heavily wooded area, these Germans may be out in the woods dug in. And if you just go by and don't flush the area completely, they'll come back into the pillbox and you're going to be caught in a 360-degree fire. And so we moved out there, and the first thing we ran into was, I realized, and I also recognized it from being from this part of the country, was that we had a Chinook wind blowing, a real warm eastern wind, and the snow started to melt. The tanks got stuck. You could hear them out there grinding in the mud, and then we got into a particular spot to where we could see most of the pillboxes in that particular area, and so we started firing at them. and we were hooked up to core artillery, and we were shooting up to 155 long toms in there that we'd send them in there. And unfortunately, a lot of those projectiles came in and hit, but they didn't go off. And sometimes they would hit a pillbox and bounce off, and they start spinning end for end. They go through and cut a tree off and this type of thing. And so we were telling them what was happening, and they said, "Well, we're shooting some recaptured stuff." So we had a lot of duds, and they did let the Germans get back in some areas in which we were drawing fire. We were all pinned down where we couldn't move from about 6 o'clock in the morning, and we just laid in this in our spots, and we had an idea where some of the areas were, and we just kept calling those coordinates in to shoot for our artillery. And so about I don't know, probably 1 or 2 o'clock, one of the 4th Division came in and took the fire off of us, and we were relieved, and so we got up and started moving, and we were going across to sort of a plowed field, and I heard a shell, and I hit the ground, and I never got up. I was hit by shrapnel, which went through my legs and body, and I looked back, and one foot was laying up next to my knee, and I was bleeding pretty well, so I started the emergency deals of trying to stop the bleeding a little bit. And one good thing is I was in a field of snow there, and that helped slow things down. And then the lieutenant came back, and he says, and then the infantry medics were in the field, and I could. He went. There was one litter bearers coming in, and he ran over and got him. And he says, "I got one here that needs to go out." And they said, "We're not to pick up anybody other than infantry." And so he came back and he says, "I can't get a litter bearer." He says, I'm going back to the line, and I'll have a litter bearer out here before too long." So after probably time at that particular point was gone. He had no idea what was going on, other than I know that I wasn't to go to sleep, and I was getting sort of tired, and I'd take snow and rub it on my face and keep myself awake, and pretty soon he and a litter bearer came, and they picked me up and hauled me out and put me on top of a Jeep hood and went to a aid station, and got first care there. And I remember the doctor came in and said, he said, unfortunately, he says, you can't respond with plasma. You have to have whole blood. And so he said, we got to move you back as soon as possible. So they took they sort of straightened out my leg a little bit, and they took a OD blanket, and they wrapped it around my leg and got some baling wire and got it all twisted on there and put me in an ambulance and went back to the back hospital. And there I took, I think, 3 units of whole blood, and Then that was the first of a process for a year and a half before I was discharged from the hospital. They they finally put me in an ambulance and started me back, and it was sort of interesting. It was right in the evening, and it got dark, and they would get back to these different hospitals that they had, and we'd drive in, and they would come out and said, "No, we can't take you. We don't have room." And and we and then we got down a little bit, and I said to the medic that I said, "You know, I don't. If we don't get into a hospital pretty soon," I said, "I don't know whether I could stand the pain in my feet." And I said, I just can't hardly handle it. What happened was that the warm new blood and all that going into my frozen feet, they were becoming more and more alive, and that was what was causing the pain. And so then he says, I know, he says, I know where there's an aid station, and I know the doctor there. He said, it's not too far ahead of here. So he said, we'll pull in there and I'll go get him. And so he did that, and the doctor came back out and he says, your feet are warming up, huh? And I said, yes. And he said, that's quite painful. And I said, yes. He said, I got a shot for you. And so he gave me a shot. But we went on, and we didn't find I didn't get into a hospital until we got back to Luxembourg City. And there I went in, and they did the surgery and so on. And we were in a room where there were about 4 or 5 guys laying on tables there that the doctors were working on. And this one doctor, he says, "Oh, I'm going to prep you for surgery." He says, "I've got to get you all set up." And so he was working there, and pretty soon he got me. He said, "I think we're all ready to go." And there was a doctor to my right, a surgeon working on a person next to me, and he turned around to and said to the doctor, he says, "I'm about through here." He says, "What do we have here?" He says, "Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to amputate a leg." And he says, "Oh." He said, "Well, I'll take a look at it." And so he finished up, and pretty soon he turned around and he examined me and so on, and he came up and he put his hand on my shoulder and looked me right square in the eyes, and he said, "Son, your leg will be on when you wake up in the." And so they did the surgery, and my leg was on in a cast when I woke up. And then I went through a period of time, which I learned later, that I did develop a blood clot that was moving, and they were doing the things that they do, and it did dissipate before it got too bad. But I got to the point that I couldn't keep my eyes open. It was too difficult, and I couldn't move or anything. And then after a couple of days, I got a little bit better strength, and then they shipped me to Nice, France, to a general hospital, and I was there for a day or two. Then they just turned right around, put me on a hospital ship or a hospital train, and I went to Cherbourg, where I loaded onto a hospital ship. Took me back across the channel, loaded me on a hospital train, and went to a general hospital east of London, which was the 155 General Hospital. And there's where they started putting everything back together. I was there for about 4 months until everything started growing back. They put me into a pin traction type thing where they kept my leg, and the thing is, when the tibia broke, it broke in pieces about that big, and those are big enough to, if you get enough blood supply, that they'll keep living. So what they were doing is pulling those back up and putting them in line and rebuilding the tibia. I had about that much of it that was broken out, and so I had got to that particular point. Then they took me out of the traction and put me in casts and put me on a hospital train, and we went to Liverpool, put on a hospital ship. 28 days we pulled into Charleston, South Carolina, to the hospital there, and I was there a couple of days, and then they took and put me on a hospital train, and I started towards home, and we went on up and to Cincinnati, to Chicago, and got on the fast train to San Francisco, and they stopped in Auburn, California. We had a general hospital there, DeWitt General, and I was taken off, and that was an orthopedic hospital, and I spent about 8 months, 9 months there, and then the bone and all that had healed back and to the point where I could sort of walk with a brace, but I didn't have any calf muscle. I didn't have anything to support it. So then they shipped me to Dibble General Hospital, which was in Menlo Park, from the Stanford University area, and there they did all of the plastic surgery and rebuilt the muscles and all of that. So after a year and 4 or 5 months, I was able to be discharged.
Quite a story. How important do you think artillery was to the infantry, to the guys that you were supporting?
It was very, very important, because this was the only way that you could pull off mortar fire and small arm fire and this type of thing. And I always felt that the artillery fire on a sort of a rolling barrage situation, a lot of times we would put a what they call a rolling barrage, and as they were moving forward, would lay down a pattern of fire which kept the small arm fire down and kept your mortarmen, who are all right there on the front line, from doing their thing, and then they have a chance to take advantage of the enemy at that point. I always felt that the artillery did the job that they were set out to do, and the thing is that I always felt that we were quite successful, because we were moving forward, except that one night that we had a counterattack that we could get out of.
Had you guys heard about the Germans killing the prisoners at Malmedy when you went up into the Bulge? You talked about you didn't want to be captured. Had you already heard about
we had heard that, right, where they took them up there and by a truckload, and then slaughtered them up there. That was, we were just south of that, where we went in, where we made the push. It was just south of where that killing took place. But we knew about it.
So that changed people's attitudes about things? Or?
Oh, I don't think so. I think you were. The thing is that one thing that what it really did do would be that we knew that if you got captured, that would be it. because you would never get back. 'Cause they'd let you lay out in the snow and die, you know. They wouldn't really take you, and so that was the one fear that we had was during that time, that if we did get cut off or get captured, that would been the end of it, and so on. So there was no chance of survival then.
I've heard that American artillery was able to mass quite a bit of fire if you had a good enough target.
Right.
That the FO team they'd start with a unit that was firing support, and pretty quick there'd be all kinds of guys piling on. Is that
right? Yeah, that's primarily what we had on that day that we took the Siegfried line. That I realized almost immediately that the FO was he wasn't talking to our what we called the Davardi, which was the fire center of the battalion, and that he was talking to the corps, and these were the long toms and the long 3-inch guns and the large 155 Howisters were all in there, and we were. I realized we were firing everything they had back there, and yeah, that's true. That's the way it worked, and they could pretty well tell in a short time really what you had out in front of you, and whether or not your fire was. In other words, you fired for effect, and whether or not you were getting effect, or you needed more. Then they just automatically just moved the orders back to the different echelons, and you got that much more fire. So it's hard to imagine, but there was an awful lot of stuff coming in that day. That's for sure.
Did you see aircraft in support of the infantry? I'm not sure if you guys ever talked to the airplanes, but
no, we didn't. The only thing that we'd had, what was along that line, you had each division had their battalions of infantry. But then they had their little liaison planes who would get up and fly, usually a Piper Cub or one of the small deals. And in our group who was the head of that was a general by the name of Ford, and it was my understanding that he was an older gentleman, and he had been in World War I, and he had developed the idea of the liaison planes flying, giving coordinates and support, and he was sort of credited for that particular part. But that was a big part of our whole. If we can't see it from the ground, they try to see it from the air. But that was quite a spot that you were pretty easy to get shot up there, as it was being down on the ground too.
Well, they call artillery the big killer on the battlefield. I assume that you know that that's true. And sometimes you saw what had happened from what you'd done. So how did you deal with those kinds of issues? I mean,
well, I really didn't let that particular part bother me too much. I think that from the standpoint of not really knowing what I did do, I mean, I didn't see the shells kill people, but I could see where they have done this and so on. So that part of it, I just in the back of my mind, I knew that I did it, and or a part of it, and but I never let that really bother me. But the thing that really bothered me, were getting to what you were thinking about, was when we made our counterattack in the Bulge and started back through, the time element from the time the Germans came through and hit all those new divisions. I see they had put all new divisions in, and we actually came in. Where we came in through where the 106th Division, which was the division that was hit by the Germans on the Bulge. The thing that bothered me was as we walked through the trees and through in there, all of the dead bodies. They weren't dead; they were frozen, and here they were, you know, in the position that they were in, and it really affected me. And the thing is, I'm having a little problem, and I know from my own combat experience and so on, with our young men that were in Iraq today and facing combat and the type of combat that they're in. The thing is, the recognition, and the thing is, we have television now and all these other things that we didn't have, which probably might have been a good thing during World War II. But I think of all these guys that were killed in the Bulge and the hardships that they went through. They're sort of forgotten, and that we give medals now to people who get in the situations and so on. There's an awful lot of medals that were not given in World War II, and the sacrifices. But you really can't compare them because they're two different situations. But I think with everybody being able to see what's going on and seeing that our young men and women are in harm's way and they are dying, and some of the recognition and so on, which is given now, which was not given in World War II. It was sort of the run-of-the-mill situation. Makes it kind of difficult having to sit here knowing what they're facing and try to relive with them what this is all about.
I understand completely what you're saying. Last question, and I'll let you off the hook. You know, there was at the time World War II, blacks were segregated from the whites, and backed over by this guy in the black tankers in a tank. You know. But what do you feel about these guys? I mean, the guy jumped down off the tank to save you. How do you feel about that?
That was never a real issue with me at all. I never thought too much about it. The thing is that in my mind, the black man who jumped out of the tank and ripped the windshield off and was so tenderly and lovingly taking care of me there, and he was afraid to find out exactly if I was hurt. He had me clutched in his arms and so on, and the thing is, you know, that takes a real loving person to do that under those kind of conditions. And so he's my hero, you know. And so I've never really had any any feeling that way.